Hello and welcome to the Classics Book Club. This is a place to come and delve into all those classics you always wanted to read. And today we'll be chatting about The Mill on the Floss. I'd like to firstly welcome Susannah Fullerton as our resident queen of the classics. Susannah has been president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia for the past 19 years. She's also patron of the Kipling Society of Australia, a founding member of the New South Wales Dickens Society and of the Australian Bronte
Hello and welcome to
Association,
the Classics Book Club.
and a member of the Dylan Thomas Society of Australia. Susannah is Sydney's best-known lecturer on classic novels, and she lectures regularly at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Welcome, Susannah.
Hi.
I'd also like to welcome book club member Sarah Burns, president of the Bronte Society of Australia, Louise Owens, who is author of the book lovers blog of choice, readmeblogsite.net, Leslie Rickman from YouTube channel Words of a Reader, and book club favourite and lover of all books, Fred Taylor. Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
And of course, we'd also like to welcome back all our book club members watching our Hangout on air. And don't forget to pop your questions into the comments and we'll do our best to get to them during the Hangout. And now to the book. Tom and Maggie Tulliver are growing up at Dorcott Mill, and passionate Maggie is always getting into trouble. While at school, Tom meets Philip, who is the son of his dad's arch nemesis, Mr. Wakeham, who is involved in a lawsuit against one of Mr. Wakeham's clients. Mr. Tulliver loses his lawsuit and things get worse for the Tullivers. Wakeham buys the family mill, which causes Tulliver to hate the Wakehams even more and to curse them in the family Bible. Tom slaves away for one of his uncles and is obsessed with paying off the family debts. And Maggie forms a secret friendship with Philip, who's been in love with Maggie ever since they first met. A few years go by and Maggie returns from a stint as a governess to stay with her cousin Lucy, and Tom has worked his way up into his uncle's very successful business. Maggie meets Stephen, Lucy's boyfriend, and the two quickly fall in love. Philip also returns, and Maggie is thrown into a messy love quadrangle. Eventually, Stephen and Maggie are unable to control their feelings and the two try to elope, but Maggie has a crisis of conscience and leaves, returning home in distress. Though Maggie reconciles with those closest to her, she's unable to make amends with the very judgmental Tom. The local river floods. Maggie goes to rescue Tom, and the two reconcile their differences, but Tom and Maggie are drowned in the flood, and they're buried together. Very dramatic novel, Susannah.
It is, and of course a tragic novel at the end. Maggie's story is not a happy one. The Mill on the Floss was completed in 1860 and proved very popular. Thousands of copies were sold in the first few months. George Eliot, the author, was of course Mary Ann Evans, and a lot of her own story goes into the position of Maggie in the novel. George Eliot, like Maggie, was a ferociously intelligent little girl. She had a brother she adored who was nowhere near as bright as she was. She was eventually rejected by that brother when she started to live with a man out of wedlock. The brother was appalled at the lack of respectability, and years, decades went by, and he refused even to speak to her. Now, while living with this man out of wedlock, George Eliot needed to take her mind off things. She was in a very difficult position, and she couldn't have children. And so the man she lived with, George Henry Lewis, suggested that she might like to try her hand at fiction. So she wrote Scenes from Clerical Life, she wrote Adam Bede, and then she wrote The Mill on the Floss. As I said, it was a very popular novel. It's been filmed. It has remained one of her most popular books. Critics generally feel that Middlemarch is her much finer work. They regard The Mill on the Floss as a slightly patchy novel. I think it's got brilliant bits, and it's also got some bits that do rather drag. But let's begin our discussion this evening by looking at the character of Maggie. She is, of course, central to the novel, her personality, her misadventures and the different episodes of her childhood, cutting off the hair, going off to the gypsies. All of those things are, of course, so important. So how did you respond to Maggie as the heroine of this novel? Did you like her? Did she leave you cold? Did you dislike her? What were your responses to Maggie? What do you think, Louise?
I thought she was very emotional, and I thought she was a great central person that a lot of things could happen to, and we could see a lot of things through her eyes. But I was always very nervous. You know, that raw emotion that she had could lead her into a lot of trouble. Where we knew that the network of the family and the sisters and aunts in particular were very strict and very structured. So kind of waiting for something to happen.
And Leslie, what were your responses to Maggie?
I think I wanted to like her more than I ended up. I wanted to connect to her more than I did, but she was definitely an interesting character to follow. She was unpredictable at times, and I liked her strength. So.
She's really too strong for a Victorian woman, isn't she? There's no place for a woman with Maggie's strength and Maggie's brains in Victorian society. Maggie, I think, would be fine as a modern woman. She'd have no trouble in today's world. She'd get on with doing something really successfully, but she has such trouble in the Victorian world. So, Fred, give us the male point of view. Did you like Maggie, or you weren't so keen?
Look, I struggle with this book, I've got to admit, and I think Maggie was probably the best of a bad bunch out of all of the characters there. I mean, I kind of like that childlike perspective that was, you know, sort of ran throughout the portion of the novel, at least that I read. You know, that she cut off her hair and ran off with the gypsies, which is quite, you know, endearing in a little way, but as from a male point of view, I still didn't really have a very strong connection with the character, or many of the characters in the book.
Damning with faint praise there. What about you, Sarah? How did you respond to Maggie?
Well, I've read this novel many times, but it's been a long time, and I'd forgotten a lot of things. So when she went upstairs, and I thought, oh, the scissors, and it all brought her back, and it's like, what's she going to do now? All these adventures that she goes on, and she's just a little girl. She adores Tom. She doesn't get the same opportunity, but she makes the most of things. But she's very willful. When her mother's trying to do her hair, she goes and puts her head in a bucket of water to ruin the whole thing. And running off with the gypsies is funny. She wants to. She wanted to be taken to their queen, and you know, because they should have had a gypsy queen, and she was almost volunteering to be the next one. They put her on the cart and took her home. I liked her. I don't. There was really no one I particularly liked in this novel, but she's probably, Fred said, the best of a bad bunch.
You might be interested to hear the comment of John Ruskin, who was a literary critic and art critic. He really hated most of the characters in this novel, and in fact he felt that George Eliot generally created terribly ordinary characters. And he said of The Mill on the Floss, "There is not a single person in the book of the smallest importance to anybody in the world but themselves, or whose qualities deserved so much as a line of printer's type in their description." So he's really damning the characters in the novel. But what about some of the aunts and the relatives who surround Maggie? I think they provide some of the comedy of the novel. Aunt Glenn, Aunt Pullet. I would never want to meet those aunts in real life or have them connected with me. But I do think they provide some wonderful commentary and comedy in the background of the novel. Did you enjoy the aunts?
Yeah, well, we're introduced to Mrs. Pullet coming in tears, aren't we? You know, and she keeps crying all the time.
Yes.
They all make their own entrance in their own way.
Letitia, did you enjoy the relatives of the book?
I think out of all the characters, they were probably, you know, the most tolerable. I can't say I'm massively, you know, I'm kind of in Fred's camp over there. I can't say I enjoy the book very much, and in fact, will admit, you know, I didn't even get to finish it. That's how I felt about it. You know, I persevered and pushed, and even those comic moments weren't enough to sort of, get me over the fact that there was 4 pages devoted to someone's mole. I just couldn't, I couldn't get through there. So yes, they were probably, my, if you want to call it, my favorite characters of the book, but even that's not saying very much.
Yes, yes. Now this, of course, is a love story, and Maggie, of course, begins the novel deeply committed and besotted, really, by her brother, Tom, who in many ways just doesn't prove himself worthy of Maggie's love. He's shallow, he's overly conventional, he's not particularly intelligent, he's rather prudish. So we begin with that childhood relationship, and then, of course, we see Maggie moving into a very intense friendship with Philip, which eventually becomes a bit more of a romantic friendship. And then finally, at the end of the novel, we have her falling in a very physical way for Stephen Guest, who's clearly handsome, not particularly a deep character or particularly intellectual. So does this novel work as a love story for those of you who finished it? Obviously, it's got a sad ending, but does it work as a love story, or are these different partners that Maggie has unconvincing or just there for a purpose? What do you think, Leslie?
I felt like Maggie was always searching for something that she was never really going to find. I just feel like the way she felt about her brother, she wanted someone like him, but her ideal of him, and it never quite panned out for her.
Mm. Yes, I think that's a good point, that she idealizes people and then finds, of course, that they don't really live up to her expectations of them. Yeah. And Sarah, how do you feel it worked as a love story? Were you excited by any of the men in the novel, or did you find them all a hopeless lot?
Well, excited's not a word I would use.
No.
I didn't like it at all. I was actually quite annoyed with Steve, and I thought, coming in, on his horse and wanting to take charge and sweep her off, and he sort of forced her to love him, really. I mean, if he hadn't been so persistent, she wouldn't have had that conflict. And then he ruined her reputation by taking her out and then not being able to bring her back. Philip, well, he's a bit hopeless, but he's brought up to be a gentleman. He's got no money. He's disabled in his own little way. He's very sensitive. They've got a very loving and intellectual relationship, but it's just for them. It sort of doesn't work beyond the two of them in reality. And I don't think anyone can compare to Tom. Tom's her world, really.
Yes, yeah. With all his faults, which I don't think Maggie ever really gets to see. Yeah. George Eliot herself commented that she was so carried away with describing Maggie and Tom as children and the various episodes of their childhood that she felt really her book was perhaps not quite balanced enough. That there was too much on the childhood side, not enough on the last book and the development of the romantic relationships and Maggie as an adult. Did you feel that it was a book that was perhaps lacking in balance? What do you think, Louise?
I'm not sure. I mean, yes, it definitely was about the childhood, and maybe that's why the romance was such a jolt, because we just got to know these children so well, and I just thought it was really out of character that Maggie was able to switch so quickly to Stephen, where I was thinking she was devoted to Philip. So was it balanced? No. Yeah, no. I think it kind of, to me, it was ended too abruptly too.
Yes, yes. And ended believably. Was there any other possibility for Maggie apart from drowning, or do you think her author, her creator, had got her to the point where there were no other options?
I was sure there was going to be a resolution. I was sure there was going to be, she was going to fall madly in love fall in love with Philip or with Stephen. But one of the best things about the book I thought was unpredictable. I had no idea where that book was like the river, like the Floss. It had its own course, and I couldn't predict where it was going to go. So that kept me reading, I suppose.
Yes. Well, of course,
I think the ending somewhat saved it.
Ah.
I like myself a good tragic ending.
Okay. Like a good weepy. Books of tissues. I sobbed over it when I first read it. And I wanted more of Stephen, and of course I wanted them to have a happy ending as a teenage reader.
Mm.
But I think now, what other options are there for Maggie? Can her creator ever give her a happy, fulfilling life? And I don't think she's ever going to get that. Women like Lucy had happy lives and romances in the Victorian era, but Maggie's too intelligent, too different, too strong, and she's not going to fit in. She'll have to keep paying the price that society inflicts on her for being so different. And that difference, for Fred, I know you didn't finish the novel, but that difference, I think, comes through from the very beginning, doesn't it? That even if you don't finish the book, you realise that Maggie is an unusual heroine. She's strong, she's feisty, and you don't quite know where her adventure's going to take her.
Yeah, there's a lot of this book that reminded me actually of Mansfield Park, but actually a more low-budget version of Mansfield Park. So you've got Mrs. Norris, is basically a lot of the aunts in the story, and Henry Crawford is, and that sort of thing is, at least from some of the descriptions I'm hearing too. But the main character in that book is so much more likable, and in fact, all of the characters are way more likable in Jane Austen's book than they are in this one. So I don't know exactly what it is, but the style of writing, the characters just do not come off as particularly very. You don't really feel much empathy for them. So I just found it very hard to move forward.
And it is quite a heavy style of writing, George Eliot. Although this is a lighter novel than Middlemarch in style, she does have a deeply intellectual style. Often her sentences go on and on and on and on and on, and you think, oh gosh, where did that sentence begin and where's it going to end? I think one of the really important things, and you alluded to this, Louise, is the really vital importance of the. Sorry, I've gone. Fix my light up. The really vital importance of the River Floss in the novel. It's a unifying feature in the book. It's used symbolically. Everything important that happens to Maggie is somehow connected to the river. And even though the ending seems to come as a shock, George Eliot has actually really prepared for it in the text by constant references to drowning and the power of the river. It's, of course, providing the family livelihood with the mill. It's there in the lawsuit. It's there with the elopement. It's really very important in the book. Do you think that George Eliot gives good descriptions of the river and the landscape in which the characters are living?
Yes. The river is so important. Maggie's first memory is of holding hands with Tom at the river. She has no memory before that, and that's the last thing in the last chapter or last part of the book that's called The Final Rescue, which is an interesting title. It gives life, but it takes it away as well.
Yes, yeah. No, it's very powerfully done, the descriptions of the river. Set in Warwickshire, which is George Eliot's own county in the middle of England, and I think we get some really lovely descriptions of the countryside and the river, and Maggie's responses to the natural beauty when she and Philip are in the red deeps, and we get all these descriptions of the natural world, which are really well done. What about Philip as a character? How did you respond to Philip? Did you like him, Letitia?
He wasn't particularly engaging, and I thought it was quite I knew he wasn't going to end up being the one because it just didn't. He didn't feel like the character that was going to ignite Maggie's passion. I thought it has to be a bad boy, rather than but I thought it was interesting that he certainly provided an interesting storyline. But I must admit, Stephen sort of came out of the blue, so I felt that the relationship between Philip and Maggie was more believable in the way it sort of developed. And but I can't say I fell in love or was rooting for one or the other, to be honest with you. Yeah.
One of the things that did actually upset Victorian readers was the scene when Stephen sort of showers kisses all up and down Maggie's arm. The fact that George Eliot was showing that women could actually feel sexual attraction and respond to it was really quite shocking to many Victorian readers. They were very upset by that arm scene, which today, of course, seems very innocuous to us. Kissing an arm is quite innocent. But that really did upset Victorian readers. And, of course, George Eliot was living with a man that she wasn't married to. So she's writing from a position that's a very difficult one indeed. And so I think she was quite brave to show that sexual attraction between, obviously, Stephen feels for Maggie, but also that Maggie feels for Stephen. Because so many books didn't cover female responses, physical responses to a man.
Was that known at the time, Susannah? As the author George Eliot didn't know?
No. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why she published under a male pseudonym. But quite quickly, the secret leaked out that it was this Scarlet woman, Mary Ann Evans, who was living with a man called George Henry Lewis, and she wasn't married to him. He couldn't marry her. He was married to somebody else, but his wife had gone off and had an affair with his best friend. It was all very complicated. Really, by the end of her life, she gained a bit of acceptance because people loved her books so much. But it took a long time, and she was very ostracized by society. The man she lived with was not ostracized, and she shows in her novels it's the female who pays the price. But it's interesting to note that George Eliot earned more than any other woman in Victorian England through her own efforts. So by writing her novels, she earned more than any other woman in her society. So that's quite an achievement.
Is that because she had a pseudonym?
Yeah, well, I think that certainly helped, yeah. So does this book make you want to go off and read more George Eliot? Fred, are you at all encouraged to persevere?
What's the saying again? Once bitten, twice shy? So,
what about you?
The other one's any better, Susannah? I actually don't know the other books, to be honest, but if there's one that's more popular, maybe I'll give that a read, but yeah, I'd have to be really low on reading material before I consider George Eliot again.
And Letitia, what about you?
Well, I have had the pleasure of reading some of her other novels, Middlemarch, The Egoist, so, and I have enjoyed those far, far more. So, Fred, persevere. This is just not a good one in my experience.
Leslie has said she rather enjoys a weepy, but how about the rest of you? I mean, Sarah, do you like to be sobbing at the end of a book, or would you rather have a happy ending?
Oh, well, I like a mix of things. I like to be surprised. Sometimes things are too predictable. I like a good twist, something you didn't see coming. Sometimes, a weepy ending is not a bad thing. And sometimes when you've been championing a couple and they finally get together despite all the odds, it's successful and you celebrate with them. So I think a mix of all. I think we need all of these different ones.
We do, yes. And it's also, of course, a very powerful feminist novel. She was a brave woman, George Eliot, and she put some of her own struggles into Maggie as to what it was like to be a very intelligent woman in a world that just didn't really value intelligence in women. Lucy is the ideal of the Victorian woman. She's pretty and feminine and biddable and obedient and doesn't get herself into trouble and seems to fall for the right person. And she does everything right, and Maggie just doesn't fit that conventional mould. So it is a strongly feminist novel, don't you think?
Very.
Well, I think love it or hate it. have said it was certainly an interesting book club tonight as a result of these different passions that I think could be quite parallel to a lot of Maggie's crazy passions in the book. So thank you all for joining us for our book club tonight. Our next book club will be on the 21st of July, where we'll be reading Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. So it'll be really interesting to see what everybody thinks about that one. So Fred, Susannah, Louise, Sarah and Leslie, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to all our book club fans out there.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.